Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this very, very cold day. Of course, having left Chicago in 2017, I did not think I would be in the midst of another polar vortex, but here we are. So thank you so much, Dr. Zamani Gallagher, for the kind introduction, the welcome, and the College of Education for having me here today. The last time I was here in Champaign, I think it was 2014. So it's been about 5 years since I was here. Back then I I had a little program at the Asian American Cultural Center. So shout out to my Cultural Center folks over there. And I remember talking with some undergraduates there and a small group of leaders. And one of them asked me, Dr. Poon, why are you so passionate about affirmative action as an Asian American? And I fumbled around a little bit, and I was like, oh, well, I guess I've just been doing this. You know, when you've been doing work for so long, sometimes you kind of, you know, it's just a given. And so I'm back to give that answer now, a much more well-formed answer, I hope. But that question has stayed with me over the last 5 years, so it's really nice to be back here to give my answer, even if the student isn't here. Whether you're here or not, here I am. I'm back. So to start giving my answer, I want to go back to 1987. And at the time, I was a 6th grader in Western Massachusetts. I grew up in a town called Ludlow, exit 7 on the Mass Pike, if you're familiar. It was standardized test day in the 6th grade, and I was completely stumped to answer this one question on the test. Black, white, or other? And it was the demographic question at the very start. The test hadn't even started, and I was just like, I'm stuck. And to give you a little bit of background of the community I grew up in, it still is a working class white community, a lot of white immigrants from Portugal and Poland. I was the color. I was the student of color for many, many years in my school until my brothers came along and entered the school system. So it was rough. It was a very difficult place to grow up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants in this community. And so I had a lot of racial bullying, and I didn't know about Asian American history at the time, but you know, I'd learned a little, like the little smidge of Black history. And so I raised my hand and I asked my teacher, Ms. S., you know, how do I answer this question? She came over and she was just like, oh, well. And then several other kids around me, we all kind of ended up in this conversation about how do I answer this question. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm not white because y'all don't treat me like I'm white. And I don't think I'm Black. But, you know, I do experience racism, and other seems really odd and uncomfortable. But, you know, so I think in reflecting on that experience and that memory, what I was really experiencing was the challenge of the color line that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote so eloquently about in 1903. That is the problem of the 20th, 21st, and so on and so forth, the problem, right, of the color line in the United States. And in The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois asked the question to African Americans specifically, how does it feel to be a problem? Fast forward to 2001, Vijay Prashad actually wrote a book called The Karma of Brown Folk, and asked South Asian Americans specifically, how does it feel to be a solution? And as I've been reflecting on my racial dilemma as a 6th grader and the question that the Illinois student asked me 5 years ago, you know, this is actually at the heart of a lot of the research that I do, trying to figure out the color line and the relationship that Asian Americans have with it. But more specifically, because what I realized was these questions are about feelings, and feelings are great. They're important, we need to acknowledge them. But what they ignore, I think these questions specifically ignore, is subjectivity. And so the question at the heart of a lot of the research I do is, how do Asian Americans position themselves along the color line, and why? A sub-question is, how do others position Asian Americans along the color line, and why? So given that background, and thinking specifically about affirmative action, and you can think about other debates in education, such as school assignments, and right now there's a really heated debate in New York City about the selective public high schools there and how they select students to go and enroll. What I realize is that that question then leads to choices. And what I've decided, and I've been working on this book forever, so this is part of the title of my book that just won't write itself, is there's a choice between just us, right, which is, I define as a self-interested investment in personal advancement within the status quo systemic reproduction of inequality. So this is the way it works. New York City high schools has one test. That test alone is what demonstrates who gets into Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, et cetera. That system works very well for some and works awful for others. We will invest in that system of inequalities. And that is just us. Which is very different, even though those advocates would say they're fighting for justice. Justice, on the other hand, is really acting in systemically transformative ways to affirm values of racial equity. So it's an expansive notion. It's not just about my self-interest, it's about all of our self-interests. And so there are these choices that I've been writing about for Asian Americans, and I think for others as well. And they're ideological, political choices. And how we arrive at them, I think it's important to note this notion of racial literacy. So what as I present today, we need to develop an understanding of racial literacy to get to those choices, right, of either choosing self-interest advancement or a radical, inclusive, expansive notion of justice. It really depends on our levels of racial literacy. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania wrote a book called Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools. He's a ed psychologist, and this is a quote from within his book. It says, it's an interview they did where one of his interview participants said, "My mother didn't give us the talk because she was worried about money or reputation or us misbehaving. She gave us that talk to remind us that some people in the world would interpret us misbehaving just by being black." So within African American communities and some families, becoming literate about how race works in society can be a matter of life and death, as we've been seeing so often in the media and reality. Drawing from Stevenson's work on this notion of racial literacy, I argue for a critical racial literacy that not only allows people to better understand how racism works, but can also lead to collective movements for transformative systemic changes. So when we think about literacy, you know, we often think about understanding how to read and write words, right? Letters, words, language, right? But as Paulo Freire explained in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, critical literacy in pedagogy has to be about learning to understand how the world works, social systems work, in order to change the world collectively, dialogically. And I have a 3-year-old at home, and one of her favorite shows right now is Super Y on PBS. Don't think about the song because it will be stuck with you forever. And I was watching with her last week, and it struck me that Paulo Freire's lessons are actually as simple as a preschooler's TV show lesson. And Super Y, in the closing song, said, you know, they shout, the super readers basically shout, "With the power to read, we can change the story," right? And so that's the question. If we believe in racial justice and equity, how do we change the story? We first have to learn how to read. We have to become critically literate in the systems of oppression and the outcomes. How do these outcomes get produced, right? And so my own racial literacy development didn't really happen until college when I took an Asian American studies class and it just blew my mind. That class helped me make sense of the systems that produce racism, my own personal experiences, and what I observed around me in the world. I also learned that political choices and engagement in collective actions can change social structures and outcomes, affecting not just me and other Asian Americans, but a whole society. I learned that the whole story can be changed. I also learned through the study of Asian American history, differences in racial ideologies and racial literacy can lead to divergent political perspectives and actions that bear broader racial implications. So let me explain. So I already told you about what racial justice and racial just us is, but when we bring together literacy and ideology, what we have is, on the side of racial justice, I believe that critical systemic racial analysis if we have a critical racial literacy of how injustices operate in the world and occur, we are more apt to be aligned with an ideology of racial justice. On the right side, you have racial just us, and that can be very much informed by no or limited systemic racial analysis, or what some people have said, use the term colorblind racism. I recently read an article by Subini Anima, a critical disability studies scholar, who said, when we're talking about this kind of racism, it's really a color evasive racism, right? It's evading acknowledging systems of racism. So I attribute Dr. Anima for that term of color evasive racism. And so these ideological differences, depending on our levels of racial literacy, our critical racial literacy, can lead to either a reinforcement of systems of inequality, choices that reinforce systems of inequality and perhaps advance our own personal individual self-interests of just us, or they can advance systemic changes for radically inclusive racial equity and justice. So to further demonstrate this, let me give you a little bit of a very brief historical lesson overview. Brief U.S. immigration history from 1790 to 1924. Just really quick. So this is a political cartoon. I don't know if everyone can see. It was printed in the late 1800s. It's a fence, a wooden fence that says exclusion fence, and on the right it says registration plank. And the demon that is behind the fence is essentially a Chinese immigrant, a potential Chinese immigrant. So this is during the time of Chinese exclusion, and I start with 1790, and that's very important because in 1790, as a new nation, we had our first immigration law, the U.S. naturalization law, which prohibited naturalization of non-white immigrants. So anyone who wasn't deemed white could not become a U.S. citizen. Then, fast forward to 1868, shortly after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was ratified. And perhaps you've been hearing a lot about the 14th Amendment, given the immigration debate that we're currently in. The key passage here is, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and the state wherein they reside. A few years later, 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which started out with banning immigration from China, but then included Korea and India and basically all of Asia, with the exception of the Philippines, because they were, like Puerto Rico, a jurisdiction of the United States at that time, a colony, if you will. Now, then in 1917 to 1924, so about 100 years ago, you had a series of immigration laws that were enacted to create what's called the Asiatic Barred Zone, banning immigration from Asia. In 1924, there was an immigration law that really put all of that into place and just really solidified these racialized bans on immigration. I bring this quote that I recently saw that I find very interesting and intriguing. In 1924, at the Ku Klux Klan convention, the governor of Georgia, Clifford Walker, stated, "Build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven against the flow of immigrants." That's interesting. It's like if we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it or something. So that's the context. Context matters. And so there's a couple of historical narratives I want to share with you all, and some of you may already know this, to demonstrate this notion of just us, first off. How many of you have ever heard of Tako Ozawa? Of course. So Tako Ozawa in 1924, within this very xenophobic, anti-Asian climate and context, he was a Japanese-American immigrant, and I think he's a really great case study of respectability politics. He was a business owner, he did all the right things, he was a productive citizen in his community, and he wanted to become an American citizen. And especially given that very hostile climate, he wanted to have the rights of a U.S. citizen. So he petitioned, and the government said no, and he sued, and he lost. But what's interesting is his argument. His argument in the lawsuit was one of respectability politics. I'm practically white. I own a business. I'm a productive citizen. I'm not like these other non-whites, right? And the Supreme Court said, that's nice. You're not white. And so you cannot become a U.S. citizen. A year later, now this is where it gets really interesting. I'm saying, do you know this case too? Yes, of course. The case of Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian immigrant. This is where it gets really interesting. The year later, this case also gets to the Supreme Court. In this case, Thind says, I too want to become a U.S. citizen. But here's the thing. I recognize that the laws say it's for white people, right? Citizenship is for white people. Got it. I'm from India. There's a mountain range in northern India. It's called the Caucasus Mountains. I then am Caucasian. So shouldn't I be allowed to become a U.S. citizen? Supreme Court said, you know what we meant. Basically, they were just like, nice argument. Nope, you're still not white. Caucasian is not white. Next time you use the word Caucasian, think about that. What do you actually mean? And I think it's important, actually, sidebar, I do think it's important that we use words like white and whiteness rather than Caucasian to soften the meaning, right? Because even the Supreme Court has said there's a difference. There is a difference, a legal difference that led to Bhagat Singh Thind not being allowed to become a U.S. citizen. Okay, so that's immigration. This is sponsored by the College of Education, so we'll get to the education case. Gong Lum versus Rice in 1927. So this is in Mississippi. This is a picture of Chinese American children in the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s. Maybe y'all knew or didn't know there was a sizable Chinese American community in the Mississippi Delta. And so Gong Lum has a daughter named Martha. Jim Crow South, colored schools and white schools. Gong Lum wanted his daughter to go to the white schools because separate is not equal, and he wanted the better school for his daughter. And he also argued that, you know, well, the color schools is really for African Americans, and we want to go to the white school. The state of Mississippi said, well, he also argued, well, there's no Chinese school, right? So where is my daughter supposed to go? And the Supreme Court said, well, you're going to the colored school, or you're going to have to create a new school or something, right? But basically, all three of these cases, what's interesting about them is all three of them wanted advancement for themselves within a status quo structure of white dominance. They wanted whiteness. The way I think about these cases is that these are three cases of Asian Americans who wanted membership in a system of inequality and oppression to become for upward mobility within that status quo problematic system. All right, so these three stories demonstrate that notion of just us. It's not justice. Now, on the other hand, you have racial justice, and there's also a couple of historical narratives I want to bring up. You may have also been recently hearing about Wong Kim Ark. In 1898, this is also a Supreme Court case. And so just to repeat, the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and are subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and the state wherein they reside. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco. in the 1800s, and he had a home and a business, and he traveled to China occasionally for business and family purposes. After the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was passed and signed, he came back to San Francisco from China, and the border agent said, no, you can't come back. And he's just like, but my home, my business, everything is in San Francisco. And they're like, sorry, dude. I'm sure they didn't say sorry, dude, but you know. But so he sued, but instead of saying, hey, Chinese people were kind of like white people, he said, the 14th Amendment says all persons, I am a person, right? And so he actually won this lawsuit, and this is where we have a legal affirmation of all persons being born in the US being US citizens. Of course, we have politicians who are challenging that right now, which is quite frightening because this is legal precedent going back to 1898. Fast forward to 1974, you have the Lau v. Nichols case. Anyone heard of this one before? All right. No. Okay, good. Hopefully I'm not boring you. So Lau v. Nichols, this is also San Francisco. These are Chinese American children in the city of San Francisco. A little bit of brief history of San Francisco. Up until the late 1800s, California schools could not enroll Asian children. And teachers in schools that would enroll Chinese children specifically would lose their jobs. So it wasn't just segregation, but it was also exclusion, complete educational exclusion. So San Francisco is one of the most highly segregated school districts. This is 1974. It is 9 years after the 1965 Immigration Act, which ended racial quotas to an extent on immigration, opened up immigration significantly, ended the Asiatic barred zone. And so you've got a lot of immigrant children in San Francisco public schools and other public school systems who need bilingual education. And what's interesting is that, of course, there's a rise of Latinx population in San Francisco at the time. And the more I'm digging into this case, what's really interesting is that this is a really interesting case of cross-group coalition building, because in this case, there was a racial strategy where the Latinx families and the Chinese families agreed with their lawyers that perhaps the judges might be more sympathetic to a little 5-year-old Chinese boy named Kinney Lau. And so the Latino families and the Chinese families said, okay, put the Chinese kids out front, but we're there with you. And so the court opinion here, right, I mean, the Lau v. Nichols case, they weren't arguing we should have Chinese language instruction too. They were saying we need equal education for all, including immigrant children from wherever, right? And so the court opinion here said there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. So equality is not the same thing as equity. The same is not equitable, all right? So these two cases I've been digging into and writing a little bit more about really demonstrate that justice is about all of us, changing the game, right? Wong Kim Ark and Lau v. Nichols, they changed the whole game of how we deliver education and how we think about what it means to be a US-born citizen. So let's go fast forward to now. The framework of Just Us, or Justice, can help us better understand the growing contemporary Asian American affirmative action divide. So, of course, I gotta give you a little context about these affirmative action cases. There's specifically 3 federal cases right now. I have a lovely picture of Ed Bloom, second from the left, Abigail Fisher, her father, and that's her mother on the far left. Do y'all remember Abby? Stay Mad Abby, Becky with the bad grades, right? UT Austin, 2013 and 2016. So this is the founding leadership board of SFFA. SFFA is the organization suing Harvard, UNC Chapel Hill, and UT Austin again. They just won't let go of Austin. And what's interesting is I've been waiting for a fourth case, actually, at Wisconsin that hasn't dropped yet. And I was talking about this at dinner last night. My suspicion is that Ed and Friends has not sued the University of Wisconsin yet because Wisconsin actually very explicitly states that they target and recruit Southeast Asians. Wisconsin having a very large Hmong population, Southeast Asian population. I think that dynamic is tripping them up a little bit on the Wisconsin case, because in the Harvard case, I'm sure you've heard about this Harvard case, the news media is saying all this stuff about like Asians have great grades and test scores, and so it's not fair they're not getting in, that there's this so-called personality score, which by the way doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's been very disappointing to see the New York Times and other media sources like that reporting that there's something called a personality score. There's no such thing. And that is the media trickery that Ed Blum and his shop are so good at. So in these lawsuits, they're really pushing for only allowing schools to use test scores and grades as admissions criteria, which, quite frankly, test scores tell me a whole lot of nothing about a student. Even the College Board who sells the SAT has said, yeah, our test doesn't really tell you anything, a whole lot about the academic quality of any given applicant. So why do we still use it? Side note. It's just really fascinating that we still use it. So in 2014, when he realized he was going to lose the Fisher case in UT Austin, he started traveling the country to specifically Chinese American immigrant community events, and basically saying, I need an Asian plaintiff. I need an Asian plaintiff. Becky with the bad grades is not doing it for me. I need to have it look the right way. You can look this up on YouTube. It's all over. And so this was a very fascinating racial strategy by someone who believes that race doesn't matter. Just intriguing. A little bit more about Ed Blum. He's also an anti-voting rights activist. So if you remember Shelby versus Holder in 2013 that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that was him. He also thankfully lost another Supreme Court case called Evanwell versus Abbott. That was an anti-immigrant voter case. So he wanted to dilute immigrant voting power in Texas. So if you know anything about the demographics of Asian Americans, the majority are immigrants. This man pretending to be the friend of Asians and the civil rights leader of Asians is not really a friend when you really look at who he is and what he's trying to do. So that's the context. So what's important here is, in this case, specifically around Harvard, is all these news headlines saying that Asian Americans are against affirmative action. That's actually not true. So I have voting data here, 1996. Asian American voters in California, 61% supported affirmative action by voting against Proposition 209. In 2006 in Michigan, 75% opposed Prop 2. And research has also found that the great majority of Asian American undergraduates support affirmative action. This is work by Julie Park in 2009 and other works of hers as well. 62.6% of Asian American undergraduates support affirmative action. Political vote opinion data. This is from an organization called AAPI Data. And it's run by Karthik Ramakrishnan, a political scientist at UC Riverside. The great majority of Asian Americans continue, this is data from 2017, the great majority of Asian Americans continue to support affirmative actions, but I do have it broken down into ethnic groups, and you can see that Chinese Americans are the only group that are not supportive of affirmative action, but this is a recent change. They were also in the support column in 2012, the data that this organization did in 2012 showed that they were still supportive. Things have happened since 2012, and I won't get into that. If you really want to read about that, Liliana Garces and I have a research report out of the UCLA Civil Rights Project that talks about 4 key reasons why that drop happened. This is a rally on October 15th in 2018 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was the day before the Harvard trial began, and you had several hundred people rallying in support, including a lot of Asian Americans. It was actually a rally that was led by and organized by Asian American students and community members. The media barely touched that, and instead, they went to this other protest that same day across the river in Copley Square, where it was about the same size of a crowd, but this is the rally that got a lot of attention in the media. So don't get fooled though, right? So what's really fascinating is I've shown you a bunch of evidence that demonstrates that there's a lot of support within the Asian American community for affirmative action. And somehow, some reason, the mainstream media keeps coming back to this group. Why? I'm always baffled, right? So it's just really baffling when there's a lot of, why not at least report a fuller story? A more accurate media headline could be there's a divide, there's an Asian American affirmative divide. Even that, you know, that divide, the minority in that divide is still the opponents of the policy. So given that divide, in 2016, I decided to study why different Asian Americans believe what they believe in the debate. Like, so a mentor of mine was like, "Have you ever talked to an Asian American opponent?" I was like, "No. Why would I do that?" He was like, "Maybe you should. Like, just have a conversation, Asian American to Asian American." I was like, "Oh, that's interesting, right?" And this is 2016, right? So the political context that we're in, I was like, that would be interesting actually to talk across difference within the community. So I reached out to, I was able to complete interviews with 36 Asian Americans on both, very active on both sides of the affirmative action divide. These are people, the way I found them was I looked at the Fisher case, the amicus briefs. There were several briefs filed. There's a listing of signatories. I contacted my research team and I sought out those organizations, reached out to recruit some of these people to interview. Some of those organizations we actually suspect don't exist, but that's another story. In any case, two of the questions that we asked in our interviews was, what is affirmative action? How is it practiced in college admissions? And the follow-up question is, what's the ideal system of selective college admissions? And this is where we asked a whole lot of questions, but these two questions were, I think, for me, the most fascinating, because 30 of the 36 participants, so these are both sides, right? They either said affirmative action is the practice of racial quotas, so set aside, there's so many spots for this group, so many spots for this group, et cetera. You know, 30 of the 30, or they said their racial preferences, you know, you get a point bonus if you are an underrepresented minority, and that doesn't go to Asian Americans. So all of these people, 30 or out of the 36, had these definitions for racial, so affirmative action is a quota or a racial preference for racial minorities but who are not Asian Americans. Proponents, on the one hand, said, well, that's justified, right? These practices are justified for historical reasons, the existence of racial inequalities, systemic inequalities. Opponents said, this is unfair. I'll get back to this. The ideal system question, I said, what's the ideal system? 33 of the 36 on both sides explain some form of race, class, conscious, holistic review. Anyone see anything interesting here? So quotas and preferences are not legal. Point bonus systems are not legal. Racial quotas have all been deemed unconstitutional. So that is not what affirmative action is today. And that was kind of horrifying for me to find out that so many advocates for affirmative action were also getting it wrong. It didn't surprise me that all of the opponents got it wrong, but it was shocking and horrifying to find out that advocates were getting it wrong. And the ideal system, I was just like, wow, maybe there's not that much of a difference. Like all of these people, including the opponents, talked about, we've got a poor kid who's who's a racial minority, whatever. And I would follow up with them, like, do you mean this group, this group? And they're like, yeah, I mean, racism exists. That's the difference between these Asian American opponents versus the white opponents, is that these Asian American opponents acknowledge racism exists. And that, I think, was fascinating, right? I'm like, well, maybe the divide isn't that bad, but it is. Trust me, it is. So we need to give a quick case law history on affirmative action, right? And so in the Bakke case in 1978, this is Justice Powell, he changed the affirmative action, compelling interest for affirmative action shifted from a remedial rationale, so addressing historical racial inequalities and discrimination, to one of diversity. Diversity benefits everyone. And so diversity then justifies race-conscious admissions, race as one of many factors. But in this case, in the Bakke case in 1978, quotas were also deemed unconstitutional. 78, I was 2, but this myth continues that quotas is what affirmative action is. Justice O'Connor in Grutter reaffirmed the diversity rationale, that race can be, and specifically articulated that race can be one of many, many factors that can be considered. In the twin case, in Gratz, the undergraduate case, the decision said that point systems are unconstitutional because they're inflexible. And so this notion, this myth that like, oh, you get a bonus point or something, that's not legal, it's not constitutional. So then I'll skip over Fisher 1, we'll just go straight to Fisher 2. In 2016, Justice Kennedy again reaffirmed diversity as the compelling interest to use race as one of many factors. And in this case, he also reaffirmed that race can be considered holistically. Okay, so what exactly is holistic review? Because that's what we're talking about here. Holistic review is about human dignity. It's about looking at an individual person and recognizing that the individual applicant is a product of their family, their school, their community, the society, et cetera, right? It's an acknowledgement. Today, affirmative action is an acknowledgement that race and racism affect all the experiences of any given individual and shape the individual talents and achievements, what they can offer, who they are, how their talents have been developed. And that's what we're talking about now. This is Sally Chen. She's one of the, I think it was 8 Harvard students that testified in the Harvard case. And she's holding a sign that says, I support affirmative action because there are complex stories in Asian America that need to be told, and they can't be separated from the impacts of racism in this country. A lot of the Asian American students at Harvard, they don't have perfect scores. They're not that valedictorian. You know, they bring a very diverse set of talents and you know, perspectives and qualities to the teaching and learning environment. And that's what affirmative action is today. Still, you know, even though I did those interviews and I was like, wow, you've got some misinformation on both sides, I'm not sure that presenting evidence and information will sway anyone's minds. I was recently in a conversation with a friend who identifies as Korean American, identifies as a supporter of affirmative action, and when I told him, no, dude, it's not about like a point preference, that's not how it works, it's a holistic review process, he was like, I don't believe you. And I'm like, but how do I, so this is where I was like, well, I used to be an admissions reader. So I've seen it on the inside. I study this, how holistic review works, all that stuff. And he's like, yeah, but I got my gut. Okay, I can't argue with your gut. Like, you know, so this is where I get concerned about our political discourse, in that, are we living in a world where evidence no longer matters, right? And because the fact is, he still has what he said, I have my gut, I have my feelings, and the news headlines are corroborating his internal fears of anti-Asian discrimination. We've gone through a lot of history of anti-Asian discrimination. And, you know, we had just recently this incident at Duke where a graduate program director was emailing students saying, don't speak English 100%. You need to speak English 100% of the time, right? And so this is the kind of climate we live in. People magazine just randomly threw up a bunch of Asian actors' names that don't match with the picture they posted, just, you know, because they're all the same, right? Recently, there were 3 Chinese restaurant workers in New York City that were killed by someone wielding a hammer. We're not really getting a whole lot of headlines around that. And, you know, we have the Trump administration, right, generally speaking, and we've got deportation. So, yes, Asian Americans continue to experience racism and discrimination, so that's the context. Context matters. However, ending affirmative action, right, where some of these Asian Americans are saying, let's end affirmative action, that's not the solution to addressing this context, this reality of racism. And so this gets me back to, full circle, the question that that undergraduate asked me 5 years ago, why do you care so much about affirmative action? Because for me, affirmative action is not just about who gets to go to Harvard. It's way more than that. For me, affirmative action is one important tool, one of many tools that we need to use to do better as a society, and really allows for, it's one tool for an anti-racist agenda to change systems of inequality. So I'm going to just end it here with, so my grad school roommate, Julie Park, has a new book called Race on Campus, and really compelling read. Highly recommend everyone pick this book up. And the book ends with essentially a question of what will it take to reimagine an entirely new educational system, right? I think that's the important question that I am at this point in my career and life, is how do we reimagine creatively an entirely new system and not just say, well, it's either about using the SAT in New York City or not. It's either using, you know, it's either only using SATs and, right. I think part of this reimagination is drop the dang tests. Drop the SAT. They don't tell us anything. The people who sell it say they don't tell us anything. So why do we still use it? Secret or not so secret, we still use it in higher education because it's about the bank ratings. It's not educational whatsoever. It's about money. So we have to pick, are we about education and justice, or are we about just an institution getting ahead, a person getting ahead within a really broken system? Thank you.